Okay, sorry, it's a little past time to begin this morning. Had a little technical difficulty with the speaker system, but hopefully you guys can hear me okay. All right. So we're on Lesson 3 in our book, The Course of This World. Lesson 3. And before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Our dear God in heaven, we are so blessed to be here together once again. So blessed to be able to read your word and understand it and know what it is that you would have us to do to have eternal life with you in heaven. We pray as we study this morning, as we look at the things related to the course of this world and the way that you have set up, by contrast, that you will help us to understand what we read and what we learn, and that you will help us to be true to your word and true to the guidance thereof, and that you will help us to be true to your way and your wisdom. We pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so Lesson 3, and we're still in kind of the big picture, laying the foundation for the rest of the class. We've talked about what is the course of this world, what is the wisdom of this world, and now we're going to talk about the basic lusts of this world, and what the Bible has to say about that. So we're going to focus on this idea of lust, and what does lust mean? Lust is a word that is used, I guess you would say, salaciously in media and in conversation. It's got a connotation that is, I don't want to say negative, because I don't know that the world looks at it as negative. We would look at it as negative, but the world would look at lust as something that just is, and it's maybe fun is a better word. The world would see lust as a fun thing, and so something to be desired. If you have lust, that's a good thing. But let's look at what the Bible has to say about it. If we look at, there's a few passages here at the beginning of our lesson in Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2, if I could, if someone would read 11 through 14 for me, please. Yes. All right. And so what is it that we're supposed to deny? Worldly lust. The ESV, well, who has another word there for lust? Desire. All right. The ESV says passions. All right. So worldly lust, worldly desires, worldly passions. All right. Turn to 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. Yes. Read 2 Peter chapter 1, read verses 3 and 4. Yes, please. The corruption that is in the world through lust. So we have worldly lust in Titus 2, and corruption that is in the world through lust. Who has a different translation there besides lust? Lust? Anyone else? The ESV says corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. Sinful desire. So, all right. So there's that idea of desire again. And finally, let's look at 1 John chapter 2. And let's see. Someone please read verses 15 through 17 of 1 John chapter 2. Okay, what version are you reading there? ESV, okay. So the ESV again says desire. The King James says lust. Anyone have a different translation there? Lust, okay. All right. So what would you say is the connotation, or what is the Bible's attitude towards lust in these passages? Okay, don't like it, unlawful. All right, it's not a good thing. It's a bad connotation, right? So this is something that we're supposed to avoid, is lust, right? So we should not have lust in our lives. We should not have desire or passion in our life. Well, maybe not. All right, so let's look at Luke chapter 22 and verse 15. Read 14 through 16, please, whoever has that. Luke 22, 14 through 16. Okay, so here we have that word in the King James, right? Is that the King James you're looking at? And the King James, which is translated desire, same word. It's the same word as lust. All right? So Jesus lusted to eat this Passover. Well, we don't say that in English, right? Lust has a different connotation. So the King James translates it desire. And the ESV does as well. But it's the same word. Look also at Philippians chapter 1 and verse 23. Keep reading through 26, please. Okay, so Paul's desire is to do what? To depart, so that he can do what? Be with Christ, right? But he doesn't make that decision, does he? What does he decide to do? Well, not that he decides, but what does he say is the better choice? Okay, to stay and work with him, right? So here we have desire. Now, is the connotation that it would be wrong for Paul to depart because he lusts after it? No, of course not. No, the connotation is he desires. He has a passion for that. We all have a passion for that, right? We all want to depart and to be with Christ at some point. But Paul's saying it is good for me to stay here and to continue to work with you. All right. So again, but it's the same word, desire, as lust. All right. So 1 Thessalonians 2:17. 17 through 20, please. 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 17 through 20, please. Okay, so back in verse 17 he says, he endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face. Again, that's the same word as lust, as passion. Okay, so we've looked at 3 verses that put lust in a negative light. We've looked at 3 verses that put lust or desire in a positive light. What's the difference between these 2 sets of passages? Okay, depends on what you're lusting after, right? Okay, all right. What word accompanies the word lust in the first set of passages that we looked at, which are right there in your book, by the way? What word accompanies the word lust? Worldly, right? Okay, so we're talking about worldly lust, worldly passion, worldly desire. This is what we mean when we say lust. And in fact, the book points out, or actually I should say W.E. Vine points out, that the 3 passages we just looked at that use the word translated lust or desire or passion are the only places, I think it says the only places, the only places where the New Testament uses that word in a positive light. Everywhere else it's used negatively. So I don't know. I think that means probably that there's a lot more worldly lust than there is spiritual lust. But that's just something. I don't know. That's probably kind of a perverse thought. Okay, so let's look at a few other passages to understand worldly lust a little bit better. Let's look at... Why did I skip this? Okay. Alright, so let's look at Romans 6. Romans 6, verses 12 through 14. Could I get someone to read that, please? Okay, so the first verse is what I want to focus on here, where it says, "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body." Okay, we all understand that. We're not supposed to be sinning, and that's what he says in verse 14. Sin will have no dominion over you. Okay, that's the way it is. That's the way it has to be for Christians. But look at what else he says in verse 12. "Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, to make you obey its passions." What does that tell you about passion or lust as it relates to sin? Okay? Okay. Oh. Right? Right? Okay. All right. All right. So, would you say that passion, lust, is something that we should not have? There should be no lust. There should be no passion. Worldly. Okay. All right. Let's put a pin on that for just a second. Let's continue on to Romans chapter 13 and verse 14. Romans chapter 13, and please read 11 through 14. Okay. All right. So, we're not supposed to make any provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. What does that mean to you? What is Paul telling us? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. All right. And so, yes, I think the planning is a key aspect of this, because he says make no provision for the flesh. You don't set aside time or energy or anything like that for the flesh. We're not supposed to have, guilty pleasures. I do this. That's just my guilty pleasure. That's, when I kind of get away and let go and do this over here. I know it's not right, but it's just a guilty pleasure. I just do it and, I get it out of my system. No, we're not supposed to make provision for the flesh. That's not supposed to be in our thought process. Right? We're not supposed to make provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. So there again, we have make provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. So the flesh, what is Paul saying about the desires of the flesh? Is it something that we create in ourselves? Okay. All right. Okay, we should be in the light if we're with Christ. We should not be doing the deeds of darkness. All right, let's continue. Galatians chapter 5. Could I have someone read 16 through 24 of Galatians chapter 5? Okay, and so here we have that we're supposed to walk in the Spirit and not gratify what? The lust of the flesh. Okay. And then he says, for the desires or lusts of the Spirit, of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh, for they are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. All right. So it's a matter of, in verse 18, how we are, or who it is that leads us. Are we led by the Spirit, or are we led by the flesh? All right. Right, exactly. We are to be led by the Spirit. And so if we are led by the Spirit, we will produce the fruit of the Spirit, right? Which he outlines here. If we're led by the flesh, then we will produce the works of the flesh. Exactly. All right. So this is the point I'm trying to get to. The verses, I had a very late night last night, so I'm having a little trouble gathering my thoughts here. The desires, the passions of the flesh. That term right there, desires of the flesh, doesn't that indicate that it is inherent to the flesh? It is a part of the flesh, those desires. Right? So we have fleshly bodies. So we have desires, we have passions, we have lusts. So it's just there. It just is. It's part of who we are. So what do we do about that? Control it? Well, I heard somebody else. Sorry. Rein it in, right? Okay. What were you going to say, Keith? Okay. Okay. Right, exactly. We still have a choice. Right. To be led by the Spirit. Exactly. And yes. That's right. That's right. That was lust, wasn't it? Esau definitely had lust. Yeah, and he lost his inheritance. And I think that's what we're meant to learn from that. What did David do? Oh, Bathsheba. Right. Okay. Sorry. Again, I had a late night. I'm sorry. That should have come right to mind. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, David lusted after Bathsheba, and what did he lose? His house was a wreck. He lost his child. He lost quite a bit. Yeah, and it made the rest of his reign over Israel a lot more miserable. So, yeah, that comes up over and over again, where we make the choice of being led by the Spirit or led by the flesh. And we looked at that last week in Isaiah, I think it was 55, where God talks about your ways are not my ways, and your thoughts are not my thoughts. They should be. They should be. Exactly. If we will just do what God has revealed. All right? And so I think it's important for us to realize that the lusts are there. All right? And I don't think any of these verses that we've looked at have said, get rid of the lust. There should be no lust within you. There should be no passions or desires within you. No, that's a part of us. But it's incumbent on us, if we're going to be called children of God, to crucify the flesh, as he says here. Crucify the flesh with its passions and desires. So that's dead to us. We don't follow that anymore. That doesn't come in. That doesn't. We don't think about fulfilling those. We don't make provision for those anymore. Yes. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting. It's a, yeah. Right. Yeah. Let it die. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. I had not thought of that before. Where crucifixion is a slow, painful death, and boy, killing our lust, killing the flesh, can be very slow and painful sometimes. But we have to go through it. We have to go through it. All right. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. All right. So I think we understand this idea of worldly lust. I think I was going to look at one more passage. Let's just look at Ephesians chapter 2. And might as well just go ahead and read 1 through 10 if anyone feels like reading that far. Ephesians chapter 2, 1 through 10. All right, thank you. And so this is the I guess the theme verse for our study this quarter. The theme passage. We're talking about the course of this world, and in verse 3, it talks about that we once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. Okay, so again, we have that we used to carry out these desires, these passions, these lusts of the body, and the mind, which is interesting. So it's the body and the mind. So can you be pleasing to God simply by using your mind and thinking things out and reasoning through life? You know, using logic to figure out what is true and what is false and what is good to do and what is not good to do. Not that alone. No. Obviously, we use our minds to read the Word of God and understand it, but you know, just pure reason. And there are atheists, and that's basically their religion is using pure reason to get through life, to understand life, and to understand what is right and wrong, and the Bible teaches us that the mind has its own lusts and desires as well. And so you're going to fall into a trap. Yes. It is not in man that walketh to direct his own steps. I'm falling back to the King James, which I don't normally read, but that's what I remember. Exactly. The Bible tells us we cannot direct our own steps. We need God to show us the way. We need to be led by the Spirit and not by the flesh. All right. Any comments or questions before we move on to the next portion of our study? Yes, right? Right. It did. It made perfect sense. And that's what Romans 12 says. In Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Exactly your point. And so that's what we have to do. We have to renew our mind. We have to be transformed. So that by testing you may discern what is the will of God. That's how you learn the will of God, is by renewing your mind. Discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, anything else? All right, so we understand what worldly lust is, right? We understand what those worldly passions are. What is the world, when the world talks about lust, what are they often referring to? What is it's kind of a euphemism for something. Sex, exactly. All right, so the world talks about lust, they're talking about sexual lust. Is that the only kind of lust there is? No. All right. And of course, we just read the works of the flesh, and those are all lusts that we have to contend with, and most of those are not about sex. Can something be a worldly lust, but also be a good thing, I guess? I'm not asking that question right. How do I want to ask that? Is there something that is there something that is good in and of itself that can become a worldly lust, maybe to an individual? Right. Chocolate's a good one. Chocolate is a really good one. And we talked about my phone before. That's another one. All right. Yeah, so turn 1 Corinthians 10:6. Turn to 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 6. All right. And just read 1 Corinthians 10. Well, I'll just read it because it's one verse. Now these things took place as examples for us. He's talking about examples from the Israelites. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. All right, so there's that word desire, or lust again. They desired evil. Well, what kind of evil did they desire? Israel. What can you think of? Idols, okay. And he talks about that. Anything else? Crave? Yeah, they had cravings, that's for sure. Right. Okay. All right. So let's look at Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. And verses 4 through 6. Someone please read that for me. Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. Okay. All right. So, what version are you looking at there? Is that I think that's the New American Standard there. That's one of the Pew Bibles, right? Yeah, okay. New American Standard. All right. So, the ESV says strong craving. Anybody got different greedy desires? Okay. All right. Well, there again we have the word for lust. All right. So what was it that they were lusting after? Cucumbers and meat. What kind of meat? What kind of meat were they looking for? Fish, right? Okay. Wow. Lusting after fish and cucumbers. They lusted after salad, basically, is what what we're talking about here. What's wrong with that? What is wrong with wanting that stuff? I mean, that's healthy stuff right there. Fish and cucumbers and lemons and exactly. Yeah. So the problem was not that they wanted those things, but they allowed that lust to lead them, their flesh, to lead them to complain against God, to complain against Moses. And it says, and it calls them the rabble that was among them, the salad-eating rabble. Yeah, okay. So, seems kind of ridiculous, doesn't it? But that can be anything that the flesh desires, anything that the flesh lusts after, we can allow to become sin, is the point there. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be alcohol or sex or, drugs, other kinds of drugs, or, whatever. Yes. Very good point. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Right. And so that's. We're going to get into that a little bit more on Thursday. About what was that? Okay. We'll get a little bit more into the different kinds of lust, or the different aspects of lust on Thursday, where when we start to trust in ourselves, and we start to think that we have to provide, that God's not going to provide, and we can't be satisfied unless we provide for the flesh. And so we'll talk about the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life more on Thursday. So this is interesting. I just want to read this last paragraph in part 1, which goes to our point, and goes to this point about the Israelites longing for garlic. Many folks who might not consider themselves lustful may very well be, in some of the senses that the Bible uses the word. Their worldly lust may not have anything to do with sex. They may be lusting for a weekend on the lake that would take them away from assembling on the first day of the week for worship, or they may be lusting for overtime pay that causes them to volunteer for work at the time of worship. Or they might be lusting for that new purchase that would hinder one's giving as he has prospered. Remember that there are diverse lusts or various lusts. So that's from 2 Timothy 3:6. So that's the point, is we need to realize that we live in the flesh. That flesh has desires and lusts and passions, and they're of all different kinds. And so we need to recognize that in ourselves. We need to recognize that the flesh does have these powerful urges, and we need to decide how we're going to keep from being led by that and be led instead by the Spirit. All right, so we're going to look at, like I said, the aspects of lust on Thursday, and finish up the lesson then. Any questions or comments before we close for this morning? All right, thank you for your attention and your comments and your reading also.